Language teaching methods course and its significance. The English language teaching tradition has been subject to tremendous change, especially throughout the 20th century. Perhaps more than any other discipline, this tradition has been practiced, in various adaptations, in language classrooms all around the world for centuries. While the teaching of math or physics, that is, the methodology of teaching math or physics, has to a greater or lesser extent remained the same, this is hardly the case with English or language teaching in general. There are some milestones in the development of this tradition, which we need to briefly touch upon in an attempt to reveal the importance of research in the selection and implementation of the optimal methods and techniques for language teaching and learning. Language teaching methods refer to the set of teaching practices, approaches, and materials used by instructors to facilitate foreign language Florida learning. Throughout history, methods have responded to the changing goals of language learning, for example, communicating with foreign trade partners, supporting missionary efforts to spread religion, reading academic scholarship and sacred texts, or, most recently, facilitating interaction on transnational and global levels. Language teaching methods therefore have prioritized different skills, for example, listening comprehension, speaking, reading, and writing, given the needs of learners and the values of societies. Various theoretical understandings of second language acquisition (SLA) and Florida pedagogy have further informed teaching methods. In particular, new research developments, emphases, and trends in the related disciplines of linguistics, literature studies, education, and psychology have shaped thinking on the most effective ways to teach language. Language teaching has been around for many centuries, and over the centuries, it has changed. Various influences have affected language teaching. Reasons for learning language have been different in different periods. In some eras, languages were mainly taught for the purpose of reading. In others, it was taught mainly to people who needed to use it orally. These differences influenced how language was taught in various periods. Also, theories about the nature of language and the nature of learning have changed. However, many of the current issues in language teaching have been considered off and on throughout history. Language teaching methods in ancient times. The history of the consideration of foreign language teaching goes back at least to the ancient Greeks. They were interested in what they could learn about the mind and the will through language learning. The Romans were probably the first to study a foreign language formally. They studied Greek, taught by Greek tutors and slaves. Their approach was less philosophical and more practical than that of the Greeks. In the Western world back in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, foreign language learning was associated with the learning of Latin and Greek, both supposed to promote their speakers' intellectuality. At the time, it was of vital importance to focus on grammatical rules, syntactic structures, along with rote memorization of vocabulary and translation of literary texts. There was no provision for the oral use of the languages under study. After all, both Latin and Greek were not being taught for oral communication but for the sake of their speakers becoming scholarly, or creating an illusion of erudition. Late in the 19th century, the classical method came to be known as the grammar translation method, which offered very little beyond an insight into the grammatical rules attending the process of translating from the second to the native language. Language teaching methods in Europe in early modern times. In Europe, before the 16th century, much of the language teaching involved teaching Latin to priests. In the 16th and 17th centuries, French was a lingua franca for speaking to foreigners. Members of the court spoke French, but it was also a necessary language for travelers, traders, and soldiers. French was fairly widely taught during this period, and a study of the theoretical books and language textbooks from this period indicate that many of the same questions that are being considered today by language teachers were being considered then. These included questions about practice versus learning rules and formal study versus informal use. The status of Latin changed during this period from a living language that learners needed to be able to read, write, and speak, to a dead language which was studied as an intellectual exercise. The analysis of the grammar and rhetoric of classical Latin became the model language teaching between the 17th and 19th centuries, a time when thought about language teaching crystallized in Europe. Emphasis was on learning grammar rules and vocabulary by rote, translations, and practice in writing sample sentences. The sentences that were translated or written by the students were examples of grammatical points and usually had little relationship to the real world. This method came to be known as the grammar translation method. Though some people tried to challenge this type of language education, it was difficult to overcome the attitude that classical Latin, and to a lesser extent Greek, was the most ideal language, and the way it was taught was the model for the way any language should be taught. When modern languages were taught as part of the curriculum, beginning in the 18th century, they were generally taught using the same method as Latin. What is a theory? Generally speaking, a theory is a set of statements that is developed through a process of continued abstractions. A theory is a generalized statement aimed at explaining a phenomenon. It is generally agreed that teachers' classroom practice is directly or indirectly based on some theory whether or not it is explicitly articulated. Teachers may have gained this crucial theoretical knowledge either through professional education, personal experience, robust common sense, or a combination. In fact, it has been suggested that there is no substantial difference between common sense and theory, particularly in the field of education. Cameron et al. 1992, for instance, asserts that common sense is different from theory, only by the degree of formality and self-consciousness with which it is invoked. When someone purports to criticize or go beyond common sense, they are not putting theory where previously there was none, but replacing one theory with another. The most successful teaching techniques are in one way or another, informed by principled theories. What have become controversial are questions such as, what constitutes a theory, who constructs a theory, and whose theory counts as theory. Traditionally, there has been a clear articulated separation between theory and practice. For instance, in the context of L2 education, theory is generally seen to constitute a set of insights and concepts derived from academic disciplines such as general education, linguistic sciences, second language acquisition, cognitive psychology, and information sciences. These and other allied disciplines provide the theoretical bases necessary for the study of language, language learning, language teaching, and language teacher education. Practice is seen to constitute a set of teaching and learning strategies indicated by the theorist or the syllabus designer or the materials producer, and adopted or adapted by the teacher and the learner in order to jointly accomplish the stated and unstated goals of language learning and teaching in the classroom. Consequently, there is a corresponding division of labor between the theorist and the teacher. The theorist conceives and constructs knowledge and the teacher understands and applies that knowledge. Thus, the relationship between the theorist and the teacher is not unlike that of the producer and the consumer of a commercial commodity. Such a division of labor is said to have resulted in the creation of a privileged class of theorists and an underprivileged class of practitioners.